So what I do in thinking about the cranial nerve nuclei, I like to start from the beginning. And when I start with the cranial nerve function, I start having colors. Like, remember all those, so we use blues, and we use red for motor, and we use green for parasympathetic, and we use purple for taste and other things. And I'd like to keep those consistent as much as possible. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing here. And why I have colors for different cranial nerves is because each of the function uses a different cranial nerve nucleus. And that's what this is all about. Okay, so this is my standard brain stem here. I've removed the cerebellum off the back. Here's my midbrain, here's my pons, and here's my medulla. At this point in the semester, I hope everybody recognizes that as it. All right. When it comes to cranial nerve nuclei, there's motor and there's going to be sensory. Okay. As far as the motor nuclei are concerned, we're going to cover these first, and that's going to be here. Thinking about motor nuclei, there's going to be some motor nuclei in the pons. The motor nucleus that's associated with cranial nerve number 3 is going to be here. Okay. It's going to be bilateral. Let me put my my midline in. Okay. So that's going to be the motor nucleus that's associated with cranial nerve number 3. And does anybody know the name of that one? Ocular motor. Right. That's going to be your oculomotor nucleus. Okay? And that's going to be associated with cranial nerve number 3. And if that's the motor nucleus for cranial nerve number 3, it's going to be responsible for all of the voluntary motor contractions that cranial nerve number 3 has. What are they? What's cranial nerve number 3 do as far as a motor response is concerned? Yeah, the majority of extraocular eye muscles. And then there's one more that Sam was talking about a little bit ago. Correct. It innervates levator palpebrae. That's the muscle that's responsible for initiating eyelid opening, levator palpebrae. Okay. So when cranial nerve number 3 does those two motor functions, it uses the ocular motor nucleus. Now, cranial nerve number 3 also has some parasympathetic functions associated with it. When it has parasympathetic functions, those functions are controlled by a closely associated nucleus. It's called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. I didn't leave myself a lot of space. I'll just put it right here. Okay. So this is going to be your Edinger-Westphal. Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Oh, you know, I'll be worse by the end if I don't wear this now. So your Edinger-Westphal nucleus is going to be responsible for all of the parasympathetic actions of cranial nerve number 3. Can somebody tell me what those are? Good. One's going to be pupillary constriction. The other one? Perfect. Lens accommodation. Okay. So, those are all the functions of cranial nerve number 3 that we talked about. Okay, cranial nerve number 3 innervates extraocular eye muscles, or the majority of them, levator palpebrae. It also parasympathetically controls pupillary constriction. We'll talk about that when we get to vision next week, as well as lens accommodation, which lens accommodation just means the rounding up or the flattening out of the lens in response to visualization of an object. It helps focus things specifically on the retina, and we'll get to more of that when we get to vision. Questions about cranial nerve number 3, nuclei. These are just nuclei for cranial nerve number 3. All right, cranial nerve number 4 it's simple. It's right under, so cranial nerve number 3, if you can imagine, would come out more superior in the midbrain. Cranial nerve number 4 is a little bit different. It comes from around back, and it uses one specific nucleus still in the midbrain. Does anybody tell me what that nucleus is called? That is your trochlear nucleus. Correct. Trochlear nucleus has one job in life. It just has one muscle that it's taking care of. What's the name of that muscle? Anybody? Yeah, that's your superior oblique. Superior oblique is the muscle, one of the few that isn't innervated by cranial nerve number 3, and it's innervated by cranial nerve number 4, responsible for bringing your eyes down and in. Okay, questions about cranial nerve number 4, motor nucleus. Okay, pure motor, nothing else there. Now, going down, that's 3, 4, let's keep going down and we'll look at cranial nerve number 5. Cranial nerve number 5, the motor nucleus resides about here, right smack in the middle of the pons, because remember, cranial nerve number 5 is going to come laterally out here. Okay. And does anybody remember the name of that one? Yeah, exactly. So this is the motor nucleus of trigeminal, because this is all motor function. This is the motor nucleus of trigeminal. Okay. And bless you, cranial nerve number 5 is one of those mixed cranial nerves. It has lots of different functions. This is just going to be the motor function. What's the motor function for cranial nerve number 5? Perfect. Muscles of mastication, as people I see are chewing gum. Perfect. So cranial nerve number 5 uses the motor nucleus of trigeminal to innervate muscles of mastication. Okay. Moving on down. So we've got 3, we got 4, that's 5. Thinking about 6. 6 is really easy. The cranial nerve itself is going to be very medial, so we'll put the nucleus right there, medial bilaterally. Okay, cranial nerve number 6 is going to be abducens. Let's bring that out up here. Okay, this is going to be your abducens nucleus. Okay. The abducens nucleus is another one that innervates extraocular eye muscles. That isn't cranial nerve number 3. Which muscle does it innervate? That is your lateral rectus. Yes, Spencer.
So are these nuclei just like a bunch of motor neurons?
They are, exactly. That is exactly right. These nuclei are all lower motor neurons. Correct. The motor nuclei are all lower motor neurons. Okay. The sensory nuclei are going to be second order neurons.
I just meant like
The motor nuclei are lower motor neurons.
yeah,
Yes.
just like a bunch of their nucleuses.
A bunch of, so what it is a collection of cell bodies that are in a common place all together, and that forms the nucleus. The nucleus is a collection of gray matter. Okay? Yes, Neil?
So why is there differentiation between cranial nerve 3 and ocular nerve westfall? I didn't hear westfall.
Okay. So Neil's question was, why is there a differentiation between the oculomotor nucleus and Edinger-Westphal nucleus? Because they exist in discrete three-dimensional spaces in the midbrain. They're closely associated, but they're different. Okay? It's the job of the oculomotor nucleus itself to do the motor function, but the Edinger-Westphal is responsible for innervating the parasympathetic function. two different things. So the cranial nerve 3 has two different jobs. It has motor function and parasympathetic function.
It's just the autonomic versus.
Autonomic versus motor. Yes, so voluntary motor versus autonomic, right. And cranial nerve 3 uses two different nuclei to do those things. Other questions? Does everybody get that? We'll draw that in here when we get to cranial nerve number 3. Right now, we'll just keep going. Okay, abducens. And then we're looking at cranial nerve number 7. That's the next motor that we're going to look at. Cranial nerve number 7, as you know, is a mixed cranial nerve. And it has a nucleus here and here. Okay, and you know, cranial nerve number 7, you'll find out at the end, is kind of a funky one. It has an upper division and a lower division, but for the purpose of simplicity, I'm just representing it as a single nucleus right here. Those two nuclei are like smacked together. So if you want, you can actually cut that in half and say the top part's the upper division and the lower part's the lower division. Okay, we'll talk about that later. But that's going to be your facial nucleus. That's for cranial nerve number 7. Facial nucleus, what does it innervate? Yeah, muscles of facial expression, and one more that everybody forgets about, stapedius. And stapedius. It's the job of the stapedius muscle to help dampen the sound as information's coming in. Okay. Now, thinking about cranial nerve number 7, in addition to its voluntary motor function, it also had some salivary gland and lacrimal gland function. And when the nuclei that it uses for these functions is located here, and that's called there's one that's called for cranial nerve 7, you're going to use the superior salivatory nucleus, because it's higher up. All right, nothing more than that. Okay, and the superior salivatory nucleus. What are the salivary functions for cranial nerve number 7? What glands does it innervate? Submandibular, sublingual. Perfect. And lacrimal. Okay, that's your superior salivatory nucleus. These are all considered motor. Okay, now cranial nerve number 8 we talked about. It's purely sensory, so it's not going to be involved here. All right, now thinking about the next cranial nerve that we're going to talk about is cranial nerve number 9. Cranial nerve number 9 also innervates some salivary glands, but it uses a nucleus that's a little bit lower down. It uses the inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, and as far as cranial nerve number 9, which salivary gland does it innervate? Parotid, right. Okay, so that's going to be cranial nerve number 9. So cranial nerve number 9, for its salivary function, we'll use the inferior salivatory nucleus. Now thinking about cranial nerve number 10, it has some motor function, and cranial nerve number 9 also has some motor function. Okay, both cranial nerve number 9 and cranial nerve number 10 use the same motor nucleus. This nucleus does not know who it belongs to. Hence its name. It's the nucleus ambiguous. And it lives about here. Okay, so this is going to be motor. This nucleus supplies motor function, or supplies the lower motor neurons for motor function for cranial nerve number 9 and cranial nerve number 10. And as I said, this is the nucleus ambiguous. Okay, motor function for cranial nerve number 9. What's it do? What muscles does it innervate? Yeah, stylopharyngeal, that little one. Cranial nerve number 9 has a teeny tiny little muscle to innervate for motor function, and that's going to be your stylopharyngeal. Okay, now cranial nerve number 10 has a little bit more motor function. What muscles, or what does cranial nerve number 10 innervate for voluntary motor activity? Yeah, muscles of the soft palate. Soft palate, larynx, and pharynx. So majority is swallowing and also speech. It's cranial nerve number 10. Questions about this? Everything getting there now? All right, now moving on. Cranial nerve number 10 also has another function that's going to be parasympathetic in nature, autonomic in nature. It is not associated with voluntary activity. Okay, to accomplish this function, it uses a different motor nucleus. It's called the dorsal motor nucleus. And that's going to live right about here. Okay, I'll label that as the dorsal motor nucleus. And this nucleus is nothing more than the nucleus that's responsible for helping cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve, carry out its parasympathetic functions. What is the what does it innervate parasympathetically? Heart, lungs, and GI tract. So it's parasympathetic for heart, lungs, and GI tract. Okay, so that's just going to be, parasympathetic activity that you have no control over. This is responsible for cranial nerve number 10 takes care of that for you, and that's the vagus nerve. Okay, now one more big one, and the nucleus resides in approximately this space. It's all the way here, and this is going to be the nucleus that cranial nerve number 12 uses to innervate tongue muscles. Okay, and this is going to be your hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, that's your hypoglossal nucleus. So those are all the motor nuclei that the cranial nerves use, that are located in the brainstem. Realize cranial nerve number 11, where are the motor nuclei for cranial nerve number 11 located?
And some parts of
What part of the spinal cord? Right, the ventral gray horn, C1 through C5. That's where cranial nerve number 11 houses its motor neurons. Okay, the lower motor neurons for cranial nerve number 11 are housed in the ventral gray horn of C1 through C5. Okay, quick review. Questions about motor? Motor should make sense. And as Spencer was asking, these are all the motor, the voluntary motor. Those are all considered lower motor neurons. So your cranial nerves are lower motor neurons. Okay. Questions about this? Let's move on. This is motor. Now let's look at sensory. Okay, as far as sensory function is concerned, it's a little bit dark. The sensory function, I think is pretty straightforward, just looking at the main sensations. Okay, same picture. Here's my midbrain with my cerebral aqueduct, my pons, and my medulla. Go ahead and put down my midline before I forget. So some of the cranial nerves are going to have purely sensory function, and some are going to have mixed motor function. So let's talk about any cranial nerve that has general sensation associated with it. What does it use? What nucleus does it use? Yeah, the main sensory nucleus of trigeminal. Okay, so the main sensory nucleus of trigeminal is about, let's put it here, okay, bilaterally, and you can think of them as essentially the same. The main sensory nucleus of trigeminal is also associated with the spinal nucleus. Okay? And these nuclei are going to take in all the general sensory information. All general sensory for the entire face, the nasal oral pharynx, the epiglottis, the larynx, the middle ear, the ear canal, the outside of the ears, the eyeball sensation, all of that. These, whatever cranial nerve is doing it, it's going to use these nuclei, and these are known as your main sensory nucleus, of trigeminal, and then down below, this is your spinal nucleus of trigeminal. Questions about that? So, cranial nerve number 5, cranial nerve number 7, cranial nerve number 10, cranial nerve number 9, all these have general sensory functions. Okay? They're all going to use either this combination of main sensory or spinal nucleus or trigeminal, no matter what. And that's what does that information. Now there's another nucleus that's associated with sensory function, and it sits here. This is going to be your mesencephalic nucleus. Okay, what is that color? Here it is. This is your mesencephalic, M-E-S. Mesencephalic nucleus. Okay, your mesencephalic nucleus is going to be responsible for proprioception information for muscles of mastication. So it's proprioception. For muscles of mastication. Okay, so what cranial nerve was responsible for detecting proprioception for muscles of mastication, if I remember? 5, cranial nerve number 5, trigeminal nerve carries that information. So we've got 5. Thinking about other sensory things that we have to think about. We have here, for cranial nerve number 8, we have a pair. There's the cochlear nucleus and there's the vestibular nucleus. Okay, this is going to be your cochlear nucleus. It's going to be responsible for hearing, for auditory sounds coming into the system, and we're going to cover the auditory system later on in the semester, just after the vestibular. Okay, so it's associated with hearing. Okay, and then this other one for cranial nerve number 8 is your vestibular nucleus. And that's going to be receiving information from your vestibular system in your inner ear. And again, we'll cover that later on in the semester. Yes, Ian? No such thing. Ask it anyway.
So can multiple cranial nerves use the same nucleus, or should I be labeling the nerve that's most associated?
Great question. Ian's question was, can multiple cranial nerves use the same nucleus, or does he have to label them differently somehow to know which ones are being used? Okay? Really important question. That's huge. That's what I'm trying to show. The answer is all of the cranial nerves use these nuclei depending on their function. Okay? And what you're going to see is I'm going to use, bless you, the same color for the same functions that use the same nucleus. So can associate them. So if you know the cranial nerve function, you should know what nucleus it uses to accomplish that function. Because you know
Right, so they don't all have their own nuclei.
they all share, okay? But they share based on the function. Just because it's going out through that cranial nerve, it's all coming from that. So as far as sensory is concerned, it's coming in and going to that sensory area. As far as motor is concerned, it tends to be more individual, right? You see that sensory information is coming in. I kind of think about like the main sensory and the spinal nucleus, the trigeminal, is more like the STT, and the mesencephalic is more like DCML, right? Perception. That's another way. So, you know, general sensory is coming in through one main tract for all cranial nerves. Does that make sense? Questions? Other questions about that? That's what you're going to see. Hopefully, we'll see it here in a little bit. Okay, moving on down, there's only one more general sensory nucleus that we have to worry about, and it stands alone. It is down here in the medulla. It's a big old nucleus, and it is the solitary nucleus. This is your solitary nucleus. Okay. The big function that comes along with the solitary nucleus is going to be what? Taste. Cranial nerve number 7 uses it. Cranial nerve number 9 uses it, and cranial nerve number 10 all use the solitary nucleus for taste. Okay, 3 different cranial nerves all using the same nuclei. Absolutely. Cranial nerve number 7 is involved in taste, anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Cranial nerve number 9 is involved in taste, posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And cranial nerve number 10 is involved in taste. That's the base of the tongue and the epiglottis. Okay? All 3 of those cranial nerves use the solitary nucleus to perceive that function, or to give afferent information into the solitary nucleus. 3 different cranial nerves. Okay, the other funky thing about the solitary nucleus is it also detects information from the carotid body. Which cranial nerve is responsible for sensory for the carotid body? Does anybody remember? Glossopharyngeal. An easy way to remember that is cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, innervates one salivary gland. What salivary gland is that? Parotid. Parotid rhymes with carotid. Parotid, carotid. They both go with 9. If that helps, I hope. Right? Parotid and carotid. Cranial nerve number 9. So this is going to innervate the carotid body. Okay. And then one more strange thing that goes along with the solitary nucleus is going to be visceral sensation. So just feeling your innards, I guess. The visceral sensation from heart, lung, and GI tract. Okay, and that's all going to be received by the solitary nucleus. So which cranial nerve is involved with visceral sensation from heart, lungs, and GI tract? The wanderer. Which one's that? Cranial nerve number 10. Cranial nerve number 10. Questions about this? No questions. Yes, I have a question in the back. Mackie. Okay, good question. The mesencephalic nucleus is only responsible for proprioception for muscles of mastication. How many cranial nerves do that? Just one, trigeminal. So that's one's very specific for one thing, one cranial nerve. Now, how many cranial nerves do you know that have anything to do with general sensation all over above the neck? I don't even know how many. I probably have to count. Sit there. He's saying 4. Okay, so nerve 5 is going to be your big one, right? Cranial nerve number 7 has a little bit with your ear canal. Cranial nerve number 9 has a little bit of sensation in the back. That's going to be the posterior 1/3 of your palate, or posterior 1/3 of your tongue, and nasopharynx. Cranial nerve number 10 has a little bit with the pharynx and larynx and epiglottis. So I'm just kind of going through. Does that make sense? So there's a bunch of them. Cranial nerve 11 and 12. Nope, that's it. I can count 4. So 4 different ones. They're all going to all general sensation uses the main sensory and spinal nucleus or trigeminal. All of it. That's why it's such a big nucleus. I'm trying to draw it. And so when you make a cross section, you're going to see a circle. It's just the transverse section. But this is really, the nuclei are huge. A lot of information going in there. Does that make sense to you now? Okay. Other questions? Just stretching out. Okay. Okay, this is sensory. Now, from here on in, we're going to take these motor and sensory nuclei and hook them up with their cranial nerves. And this is, I think, the question that you guys are asking me over and over, which is good. That means that you're understanding what I'm saying or what I'm trying to say. And the next part is going to be looking at the different, where's my midbrain? There it is. I like to start with the midbrain. Okay, here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the cranial nerves that are in the midbrain, and I'm going to draw in the motor nuclei or the sensory nuclei that they use to accomplish their specific functions. Okay, so same old picture. Here's my midbrain, cerebral aqueduct, pons coming down. How many cranial nerves are in the midbrain proper? I know there's 2 above, right? You have your olfactory cranial nerve number 1 and your optic cranial nerve number 2 above the level of the midbrain, right? But how many are in the midbrain proper? 2 more, okay? Let's take the first one, cranial nerve number 3. Draw it in there. If you remember, cranial nerve number 3 is going to reside higher up. And it's at the level of the superior colliculus. This is nothing more than the topmost bump on the back of the midbrain. So we'll draw cranial nerve in here, cranial nerve number 3. And for this purpose, I'm going to draw them one. When I do the individual cranial nerves, if I put them on both sides, it gets too crowded. So I'm just going to draw one side in at a time, and I'll label it. Okay. So this is cranial nerve number 3. Which is my ocular motor. Okay, we talked about this is the first day of class, or the first day when we got to the brainstem, the cranial nerves and their function. We drew that guy in up there. And cranial nerve number 3, I drew that up a little high, but that's okay. Cranial nerve number 3 has a couple of nuclei that it uses. It's going to use this nucleus for its motor function, and it's also going to use this nucleus for its parasympathetic function. Okay. What's the name of the nucleus that it uses for the motor function? Here's the oculomotor. Okay. And the name of the nucleus that it uses for the parasympathetic function is? Here you go. Edinger-Westphal. So, the voluntary motor activity for cranial nerve number 3 starts in lower motor neurons that reside in the ocular motor nucleus. Okay, there's my lower motor neuron. That's my cell body. That lower motor neuron sends out axons that travel through, here's cranial nerve coming out the cranial nerve, and they innervate what? What are the voluntary motor functions for cranial nerve number 3? Correct. So we have extra ocular, or the majority of them, eye muscles. Okay, and then there's one more little one. Not stapedius, that's cranial nerve 7. Yeah, so little,
Oh, levator,
the levator palpebrae, the eyelid opening muscle, right. So that's levator palpebrae. That's involved in eyelid opening. Okay. So those are two of the functions for cranial nerve number 3. It also has another function that has to do with parasympathetic innervation. Oh, yes.
In the video from Monday, you drew cranial nerve 3 under the oculomotor nucleus. Is there much of an actual difference, or is it just?
It's not, when I drew it this time, I just drew it so that it worked. There's no, like, the cranial nerve number 3 exits here. Ideally, if I had the ability to do it, I would put these let's see. If this is my cranial nerve, if this is my brainstem, ideally my cranial nerve would be coming out the front. The nuclei are inside. So if I could do it accurately, the nuclei would be right behind that cranial nerve where it exits. Does that help? So I just drew it so that it's close by. Okay? And does everybody see what happened there? And actually, as soon as I did it, I said I drew that a little high, and I meant that I probably could have brought that a little bit down. Doesn't matter. But it's all in the relative position. It has to be high up in the midbrain. So both of those nuclei and the cranial nerve itself coming off from the outside. But since I'm limited to 2 dimensions, I have to have them in close proximity. Okay? Questions about that? All right. Parasympathetic functions for cranial nerve number 3 are accomplished through the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So I have cell bodies in here that send out axons that travel through as cranial nerve number 3. And that's going to be to accomplish the parasympathetic actions of cranial nerve number 3, which are, yeah, and pupillary constriction. Does everybody see what I'm trying to do here? Just with colors and functions, you can figure out what nucleus is being used. I'm trying to get you to associate parasympathetic with the green. For cranial nerve number 3, that's coming from Edinger-Westphal. Motor function's red, that's coming from the oculomotor nucleus. Questions? Does everybody see that? See what's happening? So one cranial nerve has 2 functions. It has 2 functions because it uses 2 different nuclei to accomplish those functions. Good? Okay. Now, cranial nerve number 4 is a different one, right? Cranial nerve number 4 is really easy. It's the trochlear nerve uses the trochlear nucleus to innervate the superior oblique. And I guess since it is so easy, here's your trochlear nucleus. Okay, there's your trochlear nucleus. And when we drew in cranial nerve number 4, we found that it's the only cranial nerve that exits the brainstem dorsally. So we saw it come out from back here. Okay, there it is. Cranial nerve number 4 is the only one that decussates. So information coming from the trochlear nucleus is on the left side. Lower motor neuron cell bodies send out an axon that actually decussates and travels through cranial nerve number 4 on the opposite side. And what muscle do those axons innervate? What muscle does cranial nerve number 4 innervate? Superior oblique, yeah. So this just innervates superior oblique muscles. Okay, so muscles on the, yes, Spencer. That's correct. No, it does not. We'll talk about that later. On the same, it decussates at the level of the lower motor neuron. We'll talk, that's different.
I thought you meant just.
Yeah, no, the upper motor neuron. We'll talk about how that happens later. Okay. Other questions? Okay, I think I need a 10-minute break. So.